Good morning. So I'm here in the garden, and in this episode, I'm going to answer some questions that students had about roots. It's very buggy early in the morning, so I might be swatting bugs away too. So to show you some of show you the answers to some of your questions, I've got some plants here beside me. So I'm in a field out here. So past the irrigation line, or where the sprinklers are, so on that side, that was all plants, and I tilled them into the soil to help the soil become more healthy. So feeding the soil is what makes plants healthy, because what's in the soil is their nutrients. And so then behind me is just a fallow bed. A fallow bed means I'm not planting anything in there, I'm just letting the soil rest. Okay, so just because soil is it's like an organism, it's like a living thing. A lot of scientists describe soil as a form of life. So to keep it alive, it wants to be fed as well, just like the plants. Okay, so anyways, about roots, there were a few questions related to this. So here's a plant root, and remember, this isn't about all plants, right? So I'm showing you this kind of plant and that kind of plant, and then we could look at the trees. They're another kind of plant. So when we talk about roots, there are so many different sizes and shapes. I can't explain all of them. I can say, before I get started with the grass and the dandelion here, is that, let's say a maple tree. So a big full-grown maple tree like that, its roots don't go very deep. So maybe as long as your leg. So if you were to go dig a hole in the soil and go up to your waist, so you were standing in a hole, that's about how deep the big strong roots of a maple tree go into the ground. But they go very wide, so they stretch out beyond the side of the tree, like quite a distance. So they're kind of relatively shallow. The tree is really tall, and the roots are spread out shallow more, but there's still a huge root system there, whereas small plants just have small root systems. So about, how big do they get? It depends on the size of the plant. The general rule, I would say, is if you look at a small plant, it'll have a small root system. If you look at a big plant, it's likely to have a large root system, wide or deep. Okay, so back to the grass. So the questions were about plants and roots. So I'm shaking some dirt off. Somebody said, well, what happens if stuff gets left behind in the soil? Okay, so I'm pulling out this grass because I don't want it to grow, so I call it a weed when I don't want it to grow. No plants are just weeds, it just depends on if you want them to grow or not. So I'm calling this a weed because I don't want it to grow, and it's a real interesting plant because this kind of relates to some questions about seeds too. But this plant, so because I keep chopping it down, and in its wildlife or its natural form out in the field being grazed by animals, as it gets chopped, it wouldn't have a chance to flower. So animals are constantly eating it. So what this grass does is, instead of creating flowers and seeds, and it can still do that. You can actually see here, there's a seed head developing. So there'll be little seeds in each of those spiky things, okay? But in place of that, it has this root system that's really interesting. So I'm going to take a piece off, and that's what's interesting about it, is it looks like just a root. There's no leaves anymore. So does this die? Not necessarily. You can see here even, there's a little shoot coming out of the root. Now it's not green yet, it's still root-like. But this plant is interesting because the cells are like little pieces of like kind of like Lego, right? Put little tiny pieces of Lego to make a big thing. Body is made up of cells, but they're so small you can't see them. So this root has types of cells that keep turning into roots, or they can turn into green stuff and start creating chlorophyll. Okay, so when you can see there's these little sections, I'm trying to separate them a little bit. So you can see a section, there's a little node and a node and a node, And what happens is when you're pulling this grass out, if I'm pulling it out by my hand, if I'm pulling this out by hand, I'll try to get down deep. Oh, I pulled out a big long section of the root and another one of those shoots. So that'll keep the grass, having a hard time getting going. But I'm always going to be leaving some of the root in the soil. So this plant will regrow even if it just looks like that. Just a piece of root left in the soil, covered with dirt. If it gets some moisture, warmth at the beginning, it'll start to sprout into a new grass, so it doesn't need flowers and seeds, which is kind of interesting. So that's one type of root, or it's also called a rhizome when it does that. So it's part of the plant, it travels through the soil and then pops up somewhere else. So it's a rhizome. Certain trees do that too. Actually, the largest tree in the world is a whole bunch of stems, but it's one plant underneath the soil. I forget the name of that forest, but it's a poplar forest. Okay, so other example of a root, I'm going to pull up again. This is a weed for me right now because I don't want it to grow in this spot, so it's a dandelion. So I'm going to put the shovel in the ground, and clumps of dirt are really helpful as camera tripods. So this one you have to go down deep. You can see how deep my shovel is in the ground. And then you can sometimes hear the sound of it popping away. But, so there's a root. Dandelion root. So that's pretty big, right? But the green part's pretty big too. So as the green part grows, so does the root. There's another one. Smaller plant, smaller root system, right? So this dandelions are hard to get rid of sometimes because if you snap the top off, see how I just left this little tiny piece of green stuff? That means there's going to be a spot for it to grow from. So if it got left in the soil, it would turn green again. So that's why you really got to dig dandelions out. Some people ask what's inside. Milky fluid. So you can see as I break open the root, this fluid travels through the plant. I don't know if you can see that. And when I break the leaf, you can also see there's fluid, okay, or watery stuff that goes through the plant, all the way through the plant. Back to here. So a big dandelion root, and you can see this type of root is a tap root, and then these are lateral roots, okay? And then I mentioned this before, whenever you pull a plant up, you miss a whole part of the root system because it's so delicate. It stays in the soil, but it's the part that does the feeding. So the part that does the feeding is the finest roots, okay? This taproot is more, it still does feeding too, but it's transporting. That's why when you break it open, and it's also quite thick, but when you break it open, you can kind of see it's wet inside, so it's transporting the fluid throughout the plant. So that's kind of the transport system. But the small little, there's one you can see, it's still white. But the small little roots are the feeder roots. So that's where the water and the minerals from the soil go in. Okay, and so there's another piece of grass I just pulled out. The longer you pull out, the better when you're gardening, because look, this one's actually showing you how it pops up as a new plant somewhere else. So all this part was under the soil, and then this is the same plant, but it looks like two different plants. But they're connected by the root. Okay, or the rhizome. This is a type of root. So you got the root hairs here, and then this is the main root or the rhizome. So yeah, dandelion roots can go quite deep. That's why I dig the shovel in really deep to get them out. So there's another one, okay? Whoops, with some other stuff attached to it. And you can see where I've pulled it out. Alright, hopefully you can see there's little droplets. So the roots are bleeding because all the parts I left in the soil. Right? So there's a whole bunch of the root that comes off. You can't help it. That's just, it's attached to the soil. It's almost like at a certain point it seems like the same thing, because it's just a part of the root taking in the water and taking in the nutrients. Okay, so there's some weeds. I'm going to stop there. I'll upload this one. I can add some more stuff about roots later. Thanks.